So I'm going to try and now do the sermon for you today, doing a video. It's all a bit odd, but I feel strongly that God has got things that he wants to say to us and things that he wants to share with us that I need to share with you today. So Father, I just pray that you will come and you will fill me with your Holy Spirit, that you will ensure that the words that I share are the ones that are going to help us today and move us forward, and the ones that you know we need to hear. So, Palm Sunday. In some ways, it's the second Christmas, isn't it? This is the time when Jesus comes in his glory, in his majesty, to show who he is and what he's about. A complete contrast to everything else that he's done in the past, when he's always been so low-key. And I guess one of the things that really struck me as I prepared for this sermon, I have to say I was preparing for this sermon way back shortly after Christmas, was trying to think about the way Jesus understood this time, how in his mind he was coping what was going on. And the first thing that really struck me is that, you know, most of the time we don't know what's around the corner. We don't know what's going to happen next. But Jesus had been preparing for this all his life. He did know what was going to happen next, and he was trying to shape both his life and the lives around him so that he could do what was needed to be there for all of us. And as I was preparing, I was particularly looking at some of the things that have happened in history where maybe we didn't know what was going on. And I watched the Chernobyl series. I don't know if any of you have watched it. It's incredibly harrowing, all about how lives were lost over an accident, over a mistake. For those of you who might not be aware, back in, let me check my notes, 1986, the power plant in Russia exploded. And it exploded for a number of reasons. It exploded in part because of human error. They didn't know how to fix the machine. They didn't know how to test the machine. Partly because of politics. People were being encouraged and told, you've got to do this test. We've been waiting. We've delayed. We've got to get on with it. This is what we have to do. And partly it was to do with their citizenship in Russia, where they were being told, you know, as a good citizen, you get on with this. It's more important that we get on with this and we show ourselves to be able and capable human beings, and we have to get on and do this. And then, of course, there was the practical physical stuff. Actually, the rods that they were using had never been tested out, and they'd been using the wrong materials. And this was known. This was a secret that was known, that there was the wrong materials there, that actually if you tried to shut it down and then switch it back on again, that there would be some catastrophic results. And that's exactly what happened. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives either immediately or shortly after that. And in fact, it wasn't until through 2012 that sheep in Scotland were actually declared free of all radioactivity that happened because of Chernobyl. And we just don't know, do we? We just don't know what's around the corner. And it was the most terrible disaster that had an impact on so many lives. And when I look back over the story leading up to Jesus' death and then his resurrection, it was the politics again which really struck me. People trying to fathom their way through what was happening and how to respond. And that really strikes a chord now, doesn't it? As we all are here in our own homes, and we're relying on medical advice and good government across the world for people trying to figure out what is the best way to cope with what's going on. And nobody really knows, and everybody's trying their hardest, and yet somewhere mixed in with it there's politics, there's money, there's lives, and it's really difficult. So I wanted first of all just to go back over some of the events that were happening at that time. And just prior to the Palm Sunday events, actually the story we have is about Lazarus. And it really struck me that this particular story and how Jesus was coping at that time. And it's a really odd story. It always catches me out that there's Jesus, he's with his friends, he's with his disciples, and they come and tell him and they say, Lazarus is dying. You really need to get back. You really need to go and see him. I don't know whether they thought that was about healing or whether that was about the last time to see him, but they really urged him. And Jesus says the most odd words. He says, this has got to happen. This is for God's glory. And I'm staying here for the meantime. And he stays there for 3 days or more. It's not quite clear exactly how many days, but it was at least 3 days that he stayed where he was. And then eventually he gets to see Lazarus's family. And of course, they're in tears. They beside themselves. Lazarus is already dead. Mary and Martha turn to him and say, it's too late. He has already been in the grave. And the first thing that Jesus does is he weeps. And we'll come back to that in a moment. And then he does the most astounding miracle. He brings someone back to life. And actually, this is not the first time he's done that. He's raised Jairus' daughter before now. But he does this in an amazingly public way. Everyone sees, everyone gets to see what he's doing. And he says out loud, this is for God's glory. I'm doing this raising of the dead to show you about the things to come. And it just really strikes me when I look at this, that Jesus' experience of this is not only for us, but it's also about him becoming the Son of God that he has to become to go forward. He knows himself that he is going to go through some really bad times. He's got to go through this really scary, painful experience of this death. And God does this amazing thing, and he says, look, we can do this, son. Look, here we are together, doing this thing together, raising from the dead. What kindness of the Father. What kindness of the Father to come to Jesus as he starts to face this ordeal ahead. And he says, I am with you. See, we can do this. And Jesus then says he's going on to Jerusalem. It is the Passover festival. It's this amazing festival that they have, which is celebrating what Moses did thousands of years, hundreds of years beforehand. And Moses says to all the people, I want you to wipe the sides of your house with the blood of the lamb, because that is how we're going to be saved, because that is how God's going to know that we're his. And Jesus is going to celebrate that event when the Israelites were saved from this incredible catastrophe and saved by identifying themselves with God and with all that he's going to do. And it's an amazing celebration set against what's going to happen. You know, this is about promise and joy and freedom, prophecy that's gone through the nations beforehand. And the disciples, not surprisingly, turn around and say, don't do this. You know what happened last time we went to Jerusalem. When you went to Jerusalem last time, you were, almost got stoned. What are you doing this for? And Jesus said, this is what I've got to do. And he's very public about it now. Having been so quiet in the past about what he needed to do, now he is very clear. We have to go forward. And when he gets there, Mary anoints him with oil. And again, he says, there's so many things we could be doing, so many things that you could be looking after the poor. And, that's right now. That's what we're having to do. We're having to look after the vulnerable. We're having to think about those who are working all hours, who are going out of their way for us to keep us safe. And Jesus says, yeah, actually, you'll always have to do that. You'll always have to do that. But put your focus on me. Put your focus on me. And remember that bit too, where Moses was out in the desert and they were all unwell then. They were all hit by some plague, and the snake was put up in front of them. Moses holds up the snake's staff and he says, look to this. And he calls them and he says, you have got to look to God through it all. And it's not that you stop looking after the poor. It's not that you stop looking after all the people who need you. But you need to look to me. You need to look at me and keep your focus on me. And John tells us about the politics of that time then. And he spends quite a bit of time talking about it where others don't. And we get to hear the chief priest discussion. And the chief priest says, don't you think, out of all this, isn't it better that one of us dies rather than all of us dies? What a painful thing to hear. I've been involved of late with all the work that's been trying to go on to create enough beds for everybody knowing what's about to happen. And the really difficult conversations that have been had about what happens when there aren't enough beds and there are people coming in who might not make it. Really tough. And this is the conversation that the chief priests are having. They know that they're in Roman rule, and the way the Romans ruled was they would put the Jewish people in charge and say, you make the decisions, but if you make a step out of line, we'll have you. And you will rule within the contained way that we have to do. And so the Jewish people knew, and the chief priest knew, that if they wanted to keep their religion going, if they wanted to keep their synagogue and their temple and their ability to have authority in this situation, they had to knuckle under to what the Romans said. And the decision that this priest makes is, it's better that he dies. And John's comment is, you've no idea what you mean by that phrase. You think you're talking about hundreds of people, thousands of people, but actually you're talking about millions of people, because if that one person, if Jesus dies, will be saved. And even without knowing it, there is the focus. This one man can save all of us. And through it all, we see Jesus. Jesus who weeps only on 2 occasions noted in the Bible. One is when he sees Jerusalem. And actually that's that bit that Lorraine spoke about the other day, that he calls and he says, I want to hold you like a hen over its chicks, and I weep for you. And he wept over Lazarus for the immediate situation of one death, as well as thousands. And he is here now, weeping with us, as he sees what we are coping with, what we are going through. And yet the focus is still on him. And he raises Lazarus to life. He stands beside us, sharing the grief, and yet calling us to look to him. And then he goes into Jerusalem, knowing exactly what he's going to, knowing that he is going to all those people, just like the folk in Chernobyl, who don't know what they're up to, who make huge errors with huge consequences. He goes to those politicians in Jerusalem who are saying, yeah, we'll let him die. He knows that. He knows exactly now all that we are coping with, and all those politicians who are having to make such hard decisions, and the health leaders having to make such hard decisions. He says, I come, and I come to be with you. And I know exactly what you're like. I know all your faults. I know all your failures. I know all your hardships, all your pain. And I know what you're going to do when I get there. I know you're going to kill me. And I come. And I come to you. Right where you are, in your home, in your street, in your city, in your nation, I come. Psalm 40 says, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he turned to me. He turned to me, and he heard my cry. He turns to you. He hears your cry. So what do we do about that? What do we do when he turns to us and says, I'm coming? Well, donkeys. Tiny, weeny, little donkeys. I ordered these online for you, and if we'd all been in church today, I would have handed you all out one of these weeny, tiny little donkeys. Because what you'll remember is when Jesus comes, he doesn't come on his own, does he? He comes with a donkey. And at Christmas, he came with a donkey too. When he came in to Bethlehem in his mother's womb, she rode on a donkey into the quietness, into the night, into that lonely stable, to the rejection of the innkeeper, and he came in her womb in that quietness. And then on Palm Sunday, he came again in riotous praise, everyone shouting Alleluia, and he came on the donkey. And Jesus needs the donkey, because that's all about the message that he brings, all about what he wants to say to us. That donkey is what enables him to connect with us, because he could have ridden in on a stallion. He could have said, I'm doing this big time and I'm going to go in. It would have been the sensible choice, going into the middle of a crowd. You remember when you think about all those times when we've had big processions in London for royal weddings and all the horses that have been trained for years to go into crowds and to go into difficult places. But that's not what Jesus chooses. Jesus chooses an untrained colt. And I always think this is a funny bit when you go and again, and he says, you go and get them, you go to this house and there'll be a donkey there, and you say, this is the one the master wants, I'm taking it now. Can you imagine that if there was a car? You know, if somebody turned up at your house and said, I'm taking your car, you don't mind, do you? Well, we wouldn't do it. And yet this is all planned ahead, and the donkey is there, and it's done nothing beforehand. It's not been involved in any of this kind of, it literally says it's an untrained colt. And Jesus says, untie it. And the colt is untied. And at that choice, the colt had a choice. The colt could have, that donkey could have just run off and said, well, you know, I'm free, I'm off, I'll go and do my own thing now. But that's not what the colt does. The colt goes with Jesus, goes into that public place, goes into that place with Jesus, knowing exactly how hard it's going to be, and yet trusting in Jesus, trusting in the God that comes into our difficulty. And so today, let us remember that Jesus is coming to us. He is coming to us through the infection, through the virus, through the walls of our houses, and he comes because he loves us. He's coming to you and he's coming to me, and he's saying, there's nothing that's going to stop me. Death is not going to stop me. Crowds are not going to stop me. Viruses are not going to stop me, because I love you and I am coming. And he asks that we come with him, that we carry him in his humanity and in his love, to sing a new song. That song of praise in the desert place, in the place of exile. Yep, we get it wrong. We fill him with tears. But we fill him with joy when we turn to him and we say, yeah, we'll be the donkey. We will carry you, Jesus. We will carry you. And we will accept you into our hearts. So today I pray, Father Jesus, come into each one of our hearts. Help us to open our lives to you as we have to close down so much else, Father. Help us to open our hearts to you, the Lord who comes. Amen.